in this panel discussion, now I think we've got everyone in the panel virtual table. I've got some kind of key themes that I think which have come up with the questions today, and I guess the first one is well, going all the way back to what Jim said at the very start about signs of life, and I think Felicity also said in her presentation, you know, it has to be alive. So I guess the question then for all is this the key defining factor for soil, for what we might call a quality soil or a healthy soil or a soil which is functioning, you know, you name it. The semantics are there, but is life the key indicator? In other words, if life is not in the soil, it's no longer a functioning soil, or it's no longer a soil, full stop. So who would like to take that one first?
Can I just say, when I used to teach students about soil, I used to say, well, actually, if it doesn't have life in it, if it doesn't have organic matter, so that in plants as well as animals, actually it's geology. The geologists can have it, it's not soil. So actually, by definition, soils have to be a habitat for living organisms.
Yeah, really interesting there. And of course, that maybe reflects on the boundary between soil and bedrock, as that might also be the boundary between what's a soil and what's not a soil. But anyone else wants to discuss the life in soil?
Yeah, I mean, it's the absolute starting point. Without life, you don't have soil. It's as simple as that, really. You've got unconsolidated epiphenomena. I once saw, when I first started too many years ago to remember, I got this book out from the library on soil geotechnics, and this shows how far apart we were in silos. The opening statement of this soil geotechnics manual was, "It is a sad fact that the majority of topsoils are contaminated with organic matter." So I think that indicates just how much we've got to do in healing the rifts between practices of approaches to soil. But yeah, it has to have life to bind things together, provide feedbacks, get complexity and these dynamic processes. Yeah,
there's one to frame, I reckon, that opening forward there, Jim. Has anyone else got any thoughts on this? I just including a comment that was made by one of the delegates here, that the Soil Science Society of America are changing their definition apparently to include soils without life, so that planetary regolith can be included as well.
Good luck with that one. I think that well, that's interesting, isn't it? It means the more you degrade soils and kill them, you've still got soil. I'm not sure that that's going to help us in changing direction from increased degradation to restoration.
Was any final comments on that? I mean, that's an interesting point, Jim, that you were talking about the direction, and I guess that leads into this next point about the trends within soils, because many of the talks today, many of you have talked about trends over time, and that time component is very important. So is there a risk though that if we measure soils over time, trying to pick up these trends potentially of degradation, or perhaps soil management not going in the right direction, that we're shooting ourselves in the foot, we're allowing the soil to degrade, in which case we've got the job on our hands to get it restored? Is there a way of being able to, I don't know, kind of predict when soil degradation might occur, or the kind of clues at maybe a start of a regime shift in soils? Is there anyone wanted to come up there with that one?
I think people have come up with some indicators, some statistical indicators having to deal with variance of factors as systems approach these potential tipping points. I think that if you capture those with your sampling campaign, I think you'd be better off than not knowing this is about to go south, basically. So I think those are very highly desirable things to have, these long-term records, I think. Yeah, I mean, for global change, these are also long-term trends. I mean, we present them in our experiments as sudden on treatments mostly, but they never are, right? They're sort of very long-term trends. And even though you have these long-term trends of steady increase, you can still hit a point where there might be a sudden shift in the system or a gradual change that also is very undesirable. And I think this is very important to know. Yeah.
Absolutely. Elizabeth, your scorecard approach that you were talking in your presentation, I guess that's one way of being able to see, to get an inkling of things maybe turning in the wrong direction or just changing for the worst. Is that the scorecard going to capture that early indicator system?
I think we also, it's a balance, isn't it? Actually, most farmers know things like, if I have to go and lift my potatoes when the soil's very wet and I'm using quite heavy machinery, it's quite likely I've degraded the soil and will need to take some restorative action. They don't need an indicator. They know the practice wasn't great. But we need to also be careful if we label this in the context of practices that are likely to cause degradation, because that's a little bit like saying, well, of course all potato soils are bad, so actually let's stop growing potatoes. And actually that may or may not be the case. We need to have a slightly more nuanced approach. So there's identifying practices which are likely to or act as a flag for us then to look in more detail. And there's something about the nuance here. It's important to have simple messages to communicate to farmers, but equally to not simplify too much in a way that says, well, of course we're all broken. There are only 60 harvests left, or whichever next little soundbite we want. We need to be very careful with those in terms of how we use them to challenge for change, to promote positive practice, and how we then use measurements and enable people to use measurements both from research and monitoring and farmers effectively together to look for those change points.
That's a really interesting point. Does anyone else want to discuss this point here? Is there a case that soil scientists are too reactive? This actually came up, I think, in a BSCube annual conference a couple of years ago when we were face to face for the last, since the last time in Sheffield. I think the topic there was, should soil science be proactive or should it be reactive to changes, or should we kind of preempt them and try to keep the system from not changing? Jim mentioned resilience, I guess. Is the ideal really that the soils don't need to be resilient because we're controlling them or managing them in a way that they can be functioning all the time?
Well, the danger is with that, we might be approaching those tipping points, and as Matthias was saying, signals of critical slowing down, or the correlation between disturbances, increases in variance. You might actually find that, and this actually applies to ecosystems as a whole. If you're managing it around a very tight set of parameters and not allowing the system to respond, you may end up with the thing collapsing in short order. And that's some of the danger of sort of managing ecosystems around a narrow species list. And they're going to be overwhelmed. So I think that we should be trying to manage for resilience at the highest level and not the resilience of individual factors. So the way I've put it, or it's been put in the past, is sort of same play, different actors. So there might be things that substitute, and that's very controversial in the sense of, we must keep our native species, but things, the planet and the biosphere is reacting to what we've done to it. If we're not only, we've done this to it and it's reacting, and then we're going to stop it trying to sort the things out, then we could be in real trouble.
That's interesting. Going back to the question I asked Felicity about I think the question that came through one of our delegates here about earthworms maybe declining, but other species filling in those places and filling in those roles, carrying out those ecosystem services. Felicity, I mean, in terms of being proactive, a farmer obviously can measure earthworms in their soil, and they can go around the soil. But is there a way that farmers can, instead of doing that, just spend their time, their limited time and money, on trying to enhance or increase the number, at least, of earthworms in soils? Is there any particular useful ways? There might even be farmers on the call here, land managers, that just want to know, how do you increase the number of earthworms?
Well, it's fairly simple in the sense of how you'd enhance all species. You know, you provide food and shelter for them, so increasing your organic matter and increasing the amount of time the soil is covered, so having plants growing is a good way of supplying earthworms with food. Trying to disturb the soil as little as possible. I'm not one of these people that says never ever plow. You do sometimes have to. Just not ploughing year after year after year after year, it will enhance your earthworm population, keeping the soil, as you know, a healthy soil for earthworms is healthy for your crops as well, basically. So it's about sustainable soil management. It isn't just thinking about one species, it would be about thinking about your whole system.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. So let's just move on then to pick up that topic which has been kind of floating around today. It's about scale, spatial scale. We can look at the aggregate scale, the field scale, perhaps the catchment scale, the global scale, and we've actually covered all of those, I think, in today's talk. So what scale should we be operating on? First, as soil scientists, what should we be thinking about measuring soil health or soil quality on? Does anyone have an idea on that first of all?
I think you need to do all of them. But I mean, I think you'd have the luxury of picking, like, we'll just do the aggregate scale and all will be good, right? Because there are some factors that only come into play at higher levels of the ecological hierarchy, or that manifest themselves as change at the higher level of the hierarchy. So I think we need to really be prepared to work on all these scales and identify critical factors for each of these scales. Be my first reaction.
Yeah, that's interesting. Elizabeth, the scorecard system, I mean, the farmer, you mentioned them as like a GP. The GP might do a top to toe survey. So in this case, it might be at the top of the field, bottom of the field, across the field. Is that the kind of scale that should be looking at? And what happens if the scorecards reveal very different answers for different parts of the field? How do you do that kind of an average score in that example? No.
Well, it doesn't help you manage. So in the same way as, you know, knowing, you need to know, and I think farmers do. So farmers are already working in management zones. They know the top end of the field doesn't behave like the bottom end of the field. So it would be silly to mix those two things in a bag to get one average number, because the average doesn't help. So in that context, actually the management knowledge on the ground, the local knowledge of the farmer, not necessarily in detail of their properties, but in terms of the outcomes of those behaviours at a field scale, it's actually quite useful. And you can say to farmers, choose somewhere that gives you useful information. And that's not the same as choosing sites that give you a stratified sample of all the land uses and all the types of management across the UK. It's a different question, so it needs a different sampling strategy. But if you're going to ask a farmer, measure in places that help you inform your management, they will inherently be able to do that. That local knowledge together with the agronomist or soil science knowledge can enable that kind of monitoring to happen. And actually the worst thing we can do is get them to mix soils into a bag from different places because they think that's what the scientists are telling them to do. It's about encouraging and enabling them to use their own information most effectively together with the science that we can provide.
Anyone else got any comments on that?
Well, I think Matthias is right, and you know what Liz has said is right, because that's the scale at which the farmer is trying to manage things. So that's the scale that they have to concentrate on. But we don't have the luxury of just picking a scale. It's also very dependent on what question you're trying to answer. And if you're doing something at the scale of a microcosm, then you need to be looking at those things that can emerge at that scale, and aggregate, you know, formation is a really good one at that stage. But if you're asking bigger questions and global questions, well, then that's the scale at which you've got to, you know, that's the question you've got to, that's the scale at which you've got to operate. And I don't see that we need to pick one. I think that make sure you've got an appropriate scale for the question you're trying to answer.
Mm.
And I guess
the
there's something
hypothesis you're testing.
Yeah. I think there's something important also about being aware of the scale above and below you. So this idea of, and in the jargon is hierarchical systems analysis or some such, so that you're aware of those interactions, not at hugely diverse scales, but certainly being able to put the system in which you have defined in the context of the system at the slightly higher and the slightly lower scale, and in the context of the stakeholders who might interact with it, how they view it. So that's actually just good systems analysis, being clear about your boundary and its interactions, but also the systems around you.
Yeah, that's a really interesting, and talking about as a nice link actually in terms of spatial scale. You talked, Elizabeth, about thinking about well, the scale above and below you, and that's a question that's come through actually quite a few times this morning. Is people actually want more of a discussion about depth. Here's one: I would appreciate more discussion about soil depth for sampling. There are some standards in agriculture, but do they give us enough information? And so throughout the morning, we've talked about how we might quantify, assess soil health, and many of those have been on the surface. I've kind of raised that a couple of times in the questions. So what are we doing? Are we meant to be only focusing on soil health at the surface, or should we be focusing on subsoil health just as much as topsoil health? And could I start by asking Jim that question, because in his kind of conceptual speech, there might not have been that kind of look at soil depth. So I'm going to put Jim on the spot here.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. Okay, so what's the tension here? It's a logistical one, because really we should be sampling soil all the way down to the depth at which the management or environmental factor is impacting. Now, to actually say, okay, I can imagine the funding application now, we're going to take 3,000 samples to a depth of 85 meters. That's not, so we've got to think about what can we do that's going to be authentic and credible cutting edge research about the whole soil. And we've had discussions about where does soil end? Is it the bedrock? That's when it's definitely geology, but you know, there's work been done on the deep hot biosphere, read the Colwell stuff. There's microbiology happening in that apparent dead bedrock. It's not dead, it's got organisms in it. So I nearly said how long's a piece of string, but I think you know what I'm saying here is that there's activity all the way through that what is, as you know, Dan, because you've worked extensively in this, that interface between the bedrock and the subsoil is a critical zone that we need to include in this. Whether you could do that routinely in a soil health management context, I somehow doubt, simply because of logistics and resources. But there must be smart ways in which we can do research that will then inform as to, okay, we've got a kind of triage here of what are we going to do now to measure and manage with this backdrop of the work that's been done all the way through. Well, that's the impact that's going to be lower down, and certainly what's happening to all this stuff that we just keep pouring onto the soils thinking it's going to last forever. You know, I think that it's a critical question. Have I helped?
I don't know. Has anyone else got any further thoughts on that?
Well, we have a big project here in Germany looking at the subsoil, and we are looking at the biodiversity in the subsoil. And the big surprise for me here was that there's quite a reservoir of biodiversity down there that seems to be not necessarily a subset of the diversity in the topsoil, which came as a big surprise. And I think there are some soils for which it is really worthwhile thinking about managing its subsoil. And I think one of the outcomes of this project is to map where that is the case, right? Because it could be an additional source of water and nutrients to tap into, but it's not going to make sense everywhere. Exactly what Jim was saying in terms of the triage, where is that really worth looking at in greater detail and where isn't it? But I think it's very interesting but it's also been said, because like the global change drivers all act from the top, right? So predominantly all the chemicals that we pour on, even warming, it warms from the top and then goes in. So there must be a crazy amount of gradients of combinations of factors. Some use single track mind here, but the combinations of factors must be crazy as you go down that soil. And I think it would also be very worthwhile looking at. We're thinking about this actually. Yeah. So I think it's a super interesting topic.
Yeah, crazy. Felicity, the worms, obviously at the surface, you'd be measuring the worms at the surface, but what if they don't want to come up to the surface and they're happy to stay in the subsoil? And, you know, how do soil scientists actually get down to that and measure these kind of things down there?
Well, if we've all stood in soil pits, I'm sure, and you can see earthworm burrows down to the bedrock, down to, you know, 2 meter depth for quite a few of the anistic species. So they do get down there and are possibly a conduit for some of the other biodiversity that gets down there. You see roots preferentially following these earthworm burrows down to depth. I have experience of taking 1 meter deep cores. I can't imagine how 85 meters deep would work, but it would put your back out quite considerably, logistics wise. So I mean, they are doing stuff there, and they will help the water infiltration, and it will be this conduit between the two. So earthworms are an important factor when you think about depth of soil as well.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. So, I mean, I've only got a couple of minutes now before we go to the break. So I want to ask one final kind of question or maybe theme and get your thoughts on it. And it comes back to this action, the title of the conference about health from the principle to the practice. So some questions here that we've had throughout the morning. Are we as scientists bringing anything new to the table? Do the farmers already know it all kind of intuitively already? And if they don't, will they change their behaviour in terms of how they manage their soils? How do we put everything we've talked about into practice then? Any kind of big idea on that for the end of our panel discussion?
I think farmers are actually an easy market. So I think your developers, urban soils are bigger challenges. And actually, but still in those contexts, it's conversations, it's showing, it's the old fashioned going and having a look and digging a hole and talking to people about how those functions matter that makes a difference. And no soil scientist should be afraid of going to have those conversations with practitioners. And those practitioners will challenge our ways of thinking. They'll make us think of metaphors that may or may not be useful in further communication. They'll encourage and enable us, but they'll be fascinated. And Felicity and Jim, you know, taking farmers and others to look at soils. I've never done it with you, Matthias, maybe one day. You know, it's just a fascinating thing to do, to not stay inside our silos, but constantly push ourselves to have those conversations beyond the edges. And I think that's what we need as a society, to just make sure we're constantly challenging ourselves to do, but then grounding ourselves, using that term deliberately, where we talk to each other and actually let the best of our soil science conversation happen to inform and enable us to do that better. So I think the two are important, but they need to both be happening.
Absolutely, and just a point that BSCube have a really great video called Grounded. I recommend that to all the delegates to check that out. So any final comments to kind of all the way up to the time, and any final comments for this this idea?
Can I just add at this point, one of the things I'm trying to get across is that as researchers in soils, we have the most amazing system to answer some really big questions about ecology and the world. We can carry out experiments in 3 months that, if you were an expert on lions in the Serengeti, would take you 60 years to carry out. You know, so let's not forget we've got this incredible system for asking some fundamental questions beyond what we might primarily be interested in, perhaps in soil science. I'd be fascinated to hear what other people think.
Absolutely. from earthworms to lions, I think we've captured quite a broad way of thinking about our soils. Thank you so much to all of our panelists, Felicity, Elizabeth, Matthias, and Jim. Really great. And I'll hand now back to Sasha.
Thanks, Dan. So yeah, well, I just have to say once again, thank you to all of our speakers for fantastic talks. Really, really enjoyed them. Equally impressive was the expert timekeeping. I don't know if I've ever chaired a meet or a conference with timekeeping as good as this. And I know some of you might have the tendency to occasionally go a bit over. So thank you very much for keeping to that. And also thank you to Dan for his very skillful leading of our panel discussion. Every time I listen to Dan chair one of these panels, I learn something about how I might do it a bit better myself. So thank you very much for that, Dan.